Hi, this is Jeff Abramson. I'm currently your disembodied voice. Great to see so many people attending. We are going to wait a minute or two to get started, but really delighted you're here. Just so you know, we have enabled the chat and the Q&A for all the attendees, so do feel free to start using those as well. Thanks. Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Abramson. I am going to help moderate. We're going to wait one more minute to get started. Thanks so much for joining in. Good afternoon. I think everybody joining in is afternoon, maybe evening for some. I'm Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association and also director of the Forum on the Arms Trade. And I'll be your moderator for today's event. We're really delighted that you've joined in. The Forum on the Arms Trade is a professional network of experts around the world, over 100 of us, about half based in the US, who work on arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues. The forum itself does not take positions, but we do like to hear the voices of those who have positions and thoughts on many different issues, and we're delighted to have the panelists here today. We know that a number of the members of the audience are going to have different points of view, which is great. We like to make these events as interactive as possible. So just a little bit about the format for today. We do have both the Q&A and the chat on, and there's also the possibility for you as a attendee to raise your hand to possibly speak a question. But please do use the Q&A to ask questions of us, and the chat is for everyone to discuss, but the panelists themselves will be primarily paying attention to the Q&A. Really great to have you here. We know that the arms trade itself there's lots of opinions about this. We also know that the interest in sometimes stopping the arms trade, or not stopping it completely, but not engaging the arms trade to certain countries, could lead to lesser production of weapons and the impacts of those. And we wanted to have a chance to hear from voices of people who work on the divestment side, but also to tackle the questions around jobs, which is often a question asked. If you are to sort of decrease production, if that were to happen, what happens to those jobs? And there's a lot of ideas and thoughts and things happening about that. And this is going to be the first in a series that really sort of digs into those. So I hope after this first event, you'll have a chance to join in future events that are going to be announced. But for today, I want to quickly introduce the panelists and in the order that they're going to be presenting. And the idea for us today is each of them will speak for maybe about 5 minutes. We'll do a little bit of discussion amongst ourselves, and then we will move into asking and taking questions from you all. So we really do hope you will put in questions and engage with us together. First speaking will be Lillian Mauldin, who is one of the co-founders of Women for Weapons Trade Transparency. She's a recent graduate of the University of Texas in Austin, where she and her group that she helped found has been really active on looking at how the university system is invested, and including on weapons manufacturers. And she's going to tell you about some of the work that they have engaged with in Texas with that system. After that will be Rich Stazinski, who is the executive director of the Heartland initiative, who I've had a pleasure to really, I think, only work with over the past year, where I've got to meet him. He is sort of based in the middle of the country and works with a lot of faith groups and others as they think about investments that are sustainable and responsible. And he's been looking into how this relates to the weapons issues, including emerging weapons technology, which is a new space in a lot of ways. And then finally, I'm delighted that Taylor Barnes, who is a investigative journalist based in Atlanta, is joining us today. She actually has a new article out today, which we'll share in the chat as well. But she's been doing some great work, really talking with communities that are facing, that do produce defense articles, who are facing sometimes a reduction in that production, and how industries, how employees, workers are adjusting, or how they're approaching the arms trade in ways that might not be thought of. So that'll be the order, and I'm really delighted to hear from all of them. Part of the goal for this is I think their voices haven't been heard in these discussions as much as in some others. So we're really delighted that they have accepted the invitation to speak today. So with that sort of brief introduction and a little bit of a frame, I'd love to turn it over to you, Lillian, to give us a feel for what you've been doing.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to Jeff for that introduction. And thank you so much to the Forum on the Arms Trade for hosting this really important conversation today. As Jeff said, my name is Lillian Mauldin. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Texas at Austin. I earned my Bachelor's of Arts in Honors International Relations and Global Studies with a minor in Arabic. And as Jeff said, I'm also a founding member of Women for Weapons Trade Transparency, which was founded in July 2020. So we're currently kind of celebrating our 1-year anniversary. And we're a small but quite mighty group of researchers and activists promoting transparency of the international weapons and arms trade. So in the year that we've been in operation, we've researched, crafted, planned, and launched an extensive campaign calling on the University of Texas and Texas A&M Investment Management Company, or UTIMCO, to divest from their approximately $52.5 million worth of 16 weapons and weapon systems manufacturers, companies, debt, and equity securities in UTIMCO's Permanent University Fund. And so UTIMCO manages nearly $60 billion in total. So $52.5 million is actually less than 0.1% of their total holdings. And additionally, these investments in weapons manufacturers have fluctuated greatly over time in their portfolio, with UTIMCO actually divesting entirely from a lot of these companies multiple times over the past 22 years. So they're also not getting great returns on their investments in these companies as compared to the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones. So they're really not a big staple of their portfolio. And so throughout this campaign, we've been attempting to convince UTIMCO to adjust how they use their power as an institutional investor in the market. So we've presented reasons why UTIMCO should divest from weapons manufacturing companies that have histories of international norm and law violation that are just really negatively impacting people on the planet. And so UTIMCO itself has stated its commitments to, quote, eradicate poverty and advance society. And the UT system's mission states that it will improve the human condition in Texas, our nation, and the world, and shape public policy for the common good. And it also claims that our actions are moral, legal, and ethical, and that we hold ourselves accountable when we fail to achieve this standard. So we're really just wanting to see UTIMCO and the UT system live up to those values that it's laid out for itself. So there have been numerous companies which UTIMCO is currently invested in that have been subjects of international controversy and condemnation for their complicity in violations of international human rights law and the proliferation of its products in conflict-affected areas, such as Raytheon, BAE Systems, Booz Allen Hamilton, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and Airbus, just to name a few. And so to kind of realign UTIMCO's actions and investments with its values, we've recommended that they implement a set of screens that are barring companies which produce certain controversial weapons and weapon systems. And these include investments in companies that manufacture landmines, cluster munitions, white phosphorus, autonomous weapons, nuclear weapons, and that obtain 60% or more of their revenue from arms sales. And it's really interesting because many of the world's most profitable funds have already implemented these screens and very similar screens into their investment policies. This can be seen in Norway's government pension fund. They exclude companies from their investments that produce weapons that violate, quote, fundamental humanitarian principles through their normal use. And they also exclude investments in companies that contribute to or are responsible for, quote, serious violations of the rights of individuals in situations of war or conflict. There's also a case of a United States firm, Eventide Asset Management, and their policy states that products and services that promote weapons production and proliferation are avoided. So there is precedent. Several other funds have implemented similar policies as well. And we have, of course, as many of you might expect, received a lot of pushback on these asks for divestment, both from UTIMCO and from students at UT Austin, especially throughout our process of successfully writing and passing a joint resolution through 3 student governance bodies in support of UTIMCO's divestment. One notable pushback that we got was from engineering students. So a lot of engineering students at UT were really concerned that UTIMCO's divestment from weapons manufacturing companies would harm their job prospects. And so over 100 individuals actually signed a petition against our resolution. And so while we definitely appreciate their dedication to their futures and their engagement in student government, their petition just grossly misrepresented the way in which UTIMCO's divestment would, or rather would not, impact their employment prospects. UTIMCO does not invest in these companies or in any entity to create relationships with or to ensure that UT's students get jobs at these companies. Their investment choices are actually purely a result of their exclusive fiduciary duty to the UT system and their mission to generate superior long-term investment returns to the UT and University of Texas and Texas A&M systems. So it's really just purely for that exclusive loyalty to those systems. And it's not in order to create those relationships. So this brings me to my final point of UTIMCO's arguments against adopting the screens that we proposed. So after a lot of emailing and pushback and compromising, our team was finally able to secure a meeting with UTIMCO on May 25th. And we presented our detailed report to them at their office, along with our supplemental financial performance information on a lot of weapons manufacturing companies. We took about 6 case studies from their portfolio. And so we did have a great conversation, but we were ultimately met with kind of a no in response to our policy asks. And this was because the Permanent University Fund investment policy states that social, political, and temporal factors cannot be taken into consideration when making investments. And also because approximately 98% of assets, of UTIMCO's assets are managed externally, and they've hired about 200 external partners to manage their accounts. So implementing these screens would be logistically very difficult for them. However, the Board of Regents of the UT system does have the authority to amend this investment policy and to direct UTIMCO to take these screens into consideration if they wish. And so this is why myself and my team will likely be speaking on this topic at the next public Board of Regents meeting on August 18th and 19th. And so kind of on the more public side of things, we're also continuing to work on the grassroots side, really engaging and educating our audiences on this issue. And of course, in the name of transparency, which is in our name itself, keeping people updated on our progress and kind of our next steps looking forward. And so we're always looking for similar weapons divestment campaigns and hoping to inspire and educate students at other universities to conduct their own research on their own schools' investments as well. So with all of that information, I believe my time is up. So I'm going to turn it over to Rich, who was of immense help in the consultation phase of writing our UTIMCO report. Thank you again for that, Rich. So take it away.
You're muted, Rich.
There I am. I'm muted. I was that guy. I apologize. So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. Before I tell you a little bit about our work, let me just say how thankful I am to be a part of this conversation. As someone who spends his days focused on armed conflict and rights abuses around the world, the challenges I see often feel intractable, and the opportunities for redress are few and far between. However, watching Lillian and the great team at Women for Weapons Trade Transparency over the past months has provided me with regular and necessary reminders that the next generation of advocates are even less constrained by convention than those of us that came before them. The goal isn't simply to fix our current world, but to build a better new one. And Taylor's reporting on traditional military industrial centers in the South transitioning to clean energy hubs has inspired us to not just think about how to divest from militarization, but how we might invest in practical solutions for remediation and rebirth. All that to say, many thanks to Jeff and the forum for pulling us together for what I expect will be a wide-ranging and fairly unique conversation. For those of you unfamiliar with our work, Heartland is a nonprofit practice-based research organization that promotes the fundamental rights and freedoms of people impacted by armed conflict. Our work assists investors, companies, and civil society in protecting the rights of vulnerable populations in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, while simultaneously addressing the significant material risks endemic to them. Like my family, you're probably wondering what the heck that actually means. In a nutshell, we help institutional investors like church pension funds to better understand the human rights risk exposures created by investments in areas impacted by international and internal armed conflict and military occupation. Those investments might include a Norwegian telecommunications firm operating in Myanmar, an American textile company in Xinjiang, or a multinational extractives company with operations in Western Sahara, the DRC, and Indonesia. Hopefully you now understand our work at least as well as my family. For the purpose of today's conversation, I'll speak primarily about our work with socially responsible investors, or SRIs, faith-based investors who are an important subset of the SRI community, and their efforts to exclude weapons through screens and/or divestment. While screening and divestment are commonly used terms in the investment field, their definitions are somewhat less commonly held. Generally speaking, divestment is the act of publicly and intentionally selling shares of a company as a part of a movement or campaign to reprimand them for a proscribed behavior. For example, Women for Weapons Trade Transparency's ongoing campaign to get UTIMCO to sell their Lockheed shares due to their production of weapons is a classic example of a call for divestment. Screening, on the other hand, is the removal of companies that are rated as poor performers on environment, social, or governance, or ESG indicators. This often occurs before shares are ever purchased. In the faith-based investment world, you'll hear people refer to sin screens for fossil fuels, pornography, tobacco, alcohol, and yes, weapons. It's also worth noting that many institutions view screens not as company specific, but as industry-wide. They don't just divest from Raytheon, they screen all weapons manufacturers from their portfolio. While the roots of values-aligned screening go back to colonial-era Quaker efforts against prisons, what we recognize today as weapons divestment is a vestige of the 1960s when mainline Protestant churches came out against nuclear weapons and instructed their pension funds to screen out companies that produced them. In the late 1980s, apartheid South Africa inspired new forms of screening and divestment. And by the 1990s, as concerns about weapons causing disproportionate harm to civilians became more pronounced, so think anti-personnel landmines, so too did the screens to combat them. Today, many socially responsible investors have developed and implemented weapons-related exclusion policies as a reflection of their institutional values. Such policies are typically either product-based or revenue-based. So controversial weapons are a common product-based exclusion. Under many SRI policies, certain weapons are considered controversial due to their disproportionate and indiscriminate impact on civilians during or after armed conflicts, including anti-personnel mines, nuclear weapons, cluster weapons, biological and chemical weapons, depleted uranium, and white phosphorus munitions. Revenue-based exclusions are quite common as well. For instance, many faith-based investors exclude corporations that are among the 100 leading military contractors, and in addition are dependent on military contracts for more than 50% of their sales. So we call that the 100 plus 50 rule. Both of these approaches to exclusion have their limitations, however. Revenue-based approaches are largely limited to publicly disclosed company information and reporting from the defense industry or peace-building community, which means we all owe a debt of gratitude to Defense News and SIPRI. While a product-based approach is useful, there is a significant gap when it comes to the advent of new technologies such as lethal autonomous weapon systems and surveillance technologies. For any of you who have been paying attention to the news, you will see this phenomenon with the example of NSO Group, which I'm happy to discuss later today. In other words, current practice largely fails to consider what types of new weapons should be excluded by socially responsible investors. Relatedly, the revenue-based approach doesn't account for an increasingly diversified weapons market in which the value chain of a particular weapon or weapon component is spread out among a larger array of vendors and an expanding group of companies from non-traditional markets like Israel, Turkey, China, India, are on the ascendancy, and not necessarily engaging in the same degree of public reporting on their products and revenues. Missing almost entirely from the current practice, apart from some leading European investors, is attention to conduct-based exclusion. In other words, how does a socially responsible investor respond to a company within their portfolio selling weapons to a government with a well-documented history of human rights violations? While most investment institutions have traditionally relied on UN Security Council arms embargoes to guide them, these designations represent a lowest common denominator criterion given the highly politicized nature of Security Council proceedings and don't capture ever expanding rights violating behavior of states like Saudi Arabia, the Philippines, and Ethiopia. So I think with that, I'll leave it there and then we can sort of dig into these different issues over the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Rich. Taylor, you want to jump in?
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for having me today. Thank you, Rich and Lillian. And thank you for everyone who came today. My name is Taylor Barnes. I'm a journalist based in Atlanta, and I cover the defense industry, generally through the lens of its workforce and sometimes what are called defense communities, which are cities and towns, often near military bases, where military industrial employment plays an outsized role. And today, in this brief introduction, I wanted to go over 3 areas I've reported on over the past year. And I'm going to be brief, so I'd love if you guys ask me some questions about them. First, I'm going to talk about the defense workforce during the pandemic. And after that, I'll talk about my reporting in Huntsville, Alabama, which is a town so packed with defense contractors. Its nickname is the Pentagon of the South. And finally, I'm going to talk about my news story out from Asheville, North Carolina, which is a city that doesn't currently have a significant presence of the defense industry, but is about to. So I have a few photos I'm going to share with you guys. Just one moment. Here we go. So regarding the pandemic, many people in the defense workforce were surprised to find out that they were designated essential in the same way that, for example, medical professionals and people who work in food production were declared essential. And this led to some outcry by workers that I reported on, who in some cases felt that their companies were prioritizing production schedules or profits over worker safety. So here on the left is a video that went viral among F-35 workers in Fort Worth of an employee named Anthony, who had a very severe case of COVID in the beginning of the pandemic. And thankfully, Anthony survived, but one of his coworkers didn't. And I spoke with Anthony afterward for one of the stories I did. And he was very thoughtful about it and said about the experience and said, you know what, this prompted me to think about how we work in the defense industry. We make products that are designed to keep Americans safe, but at what point does our company protect us? And then over here in the corner is another sort of story that came out of the pandemic, which were some scattered examples of defense contractors indeed nimbly repurposing their workforces to meet the needs of the pandemic. So these photos, this is one of the photos that was sent to me by military aircraft maker Textron in Kansas, showing their workers they were using the industrial cutting tables that are usually used to slice up the interiors for aircraft, like the leather interiors, and instead making PPE, again, early on in the pandemic when there was great shortages, they're making PPE for medical professionals. So next about Huntsville, Alabama. I went to Huntsville, Alabama to report what we journalists call solutions journalism, which is an increasingly popular form of journalism that's sometimes called investigative journalism about what's going right. And I was familiar with the arguments that compared the military industrial workforce with the workforce needed for the green economy, for example, that they both draw on the same labor pool, engineers, STEM professionals, advanced manufacturing, that both the military industrial complex and a Green New Deal or some similar program would create employment all across the US rather than just in a handful of hub cities. So I went to Huntsville, which is a town deeply ingrained in the defense industry, to ask, hey, is that a natural transition? Are workers indeed doing that? And I found they most certainly were. And so here on the left is one company I profiled called American Wind. The engineer who founded it, Robert Yost, adapted his understanding of jet engine technology from his time working on fighter jets to instead produce a new wind technology that he told me It's less like an airplane propeller and more like a jet engine. And that little cube you can see there is called the microcube. It can be stacked into a wall and provide the energy needs for about 3 homes. His story is very celebrated in Huntsville, and I was thrilled to get to write about him. And when that story came out about people making transitions into the green economy in Huntsville, I want to point out over here in the lower corner, I was invited on to a pro-union local talk radio show run by 2 union officials in the defense industry, one from the Army Corps of Engineers and one from a Space Force contractor. And they were thrilled about the story and wanted to share it with their listeners. And one of the union leader in the Space Force told listeners of the show that transitioning from defense to climate spending is something that, quote, actually helps working people rather than killing working people overseas. And finally, you guys might recognize this photo in the corner. This is a local icon in Huntsville and elsewhere. And that is rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, who was a chief missile maker in Nazi Germany and was brought over with German scientists to the US and eventually to Huntsville. And in what at the time was called Operation Paperclip, a secret operation to bring over German scientists. And the US had Wernher von Braun make missiles and rockets for the US. And he's most famous for having made the rocket that sent man into space with the Apollo mission. And I bring Wernher von Braun up because when I went to Huntsville, I met a few activists from the Sunrise Movement. And they said, Taylor, guess who spoke at our Green New Deal town hall? I said, who? And they said, it's Wernher von Braun's daughter. And indeed, Dr. Margriet von Braun is a highly acclaimed environmental engineer specialized in complex hazardous waste cleanup. And she'd have spoken at their Green New Deal town hall. And I bring that up because I find that just to be a really extraordinary story of, I suppose, intergenerational economic conversion, to think of where she came from and, you know, what she's doing now. And finally, very briefly, I want to talk about my news story out today about Asheville, North Carolina, where last year locals were very surprised to find out that their county officials had in secret negotiated a deal with a division of the defense contractor Raytheon to build a new engine parts plant in town that will, among other things, make parts for the F-35. And the deal was kept out of public view, and that was by design because county officials had to sign non-disclosure agreements as they negotiated it. And by the time the public found out about it, they had just one single opportunity, a public meeting that lasted 1 hour, to tell their officials what they thought about it. And boy, did they speak up about it. And you can see a lot of that in my story from today. And they formed a really vibrant protest group they call Reject Raytheon AVL. And they know the plant's coming to town. They won't be able to stop it, but they want to broadcast their outcry over this and bring home the message that they believe the green economy will create more jobs in the military-industrial complex, which is, you know, something many of you guys may be familiar with research from the economist Heidi Peltier that shows that. So I'm looking forward to any questions you guys have about these stories, and I've been brief now, but thank you very much.
Great, thanks Taylor and Rich and Lillian. Let me invite all of you to turn your videos back on and see if I can set this so people see it as a gallery. Now that you've all heard from each other, I wonder if you have sort of thoughts on what you heard from each other, including sort of recommendations on how to think about moving forward. So this is sort of an open up for any of the panelists to sort of respond to what each other said and what that pinged in your minds.
I have a question for Rich. So I love what you are saying about kind of thinking beyond the screens, and especially considering artificial intelligence and advanced weaponry, and kind of laying the groundwork for perhaps an overall more sustainable and more ethical investment portfolio, instead of kind of being kind of just looking to subtract things. So I guess I'm wondering, logistically, if you have, you know, ideas for ways forward with that, if there was to be another campaign at another university who is interested in pursuing some sort of activist work like this around a more ethical portfolio with these additional considerations in mind. I guess I'm wondering perhaps what might be the best course of action.
You know, I think we're in the early stages here, and one thing I'd like to sort of put out there is I think there's a misconception a bit about the socially responsible investors, and particularly faith-based investors, and that's because they're managing large sums of money, they must have large teams with many experts that can manage all of the issues under the sun, and that's just not, it's just not the way it is. They tend to have very limited expertise, and that's only going to become more apparent as these issues become even more complex in the coming years. And so I think a couple of things. One, I think activists like yourself need to continue to build relationships with technical experts and have to start engaging asset owners and the institutions and helping educate them as a part of an intentional process. You know, another thing that we often see is that the asset owners, so the pension funds, the real time that you can make a difference is when they're in the process of developing a relationship with asset managers, so people outside who are managing the portfolios. And so helping them get to a place where they understand the issues, they can ask the right set of questions before they get into an extended relationship with an asset manager who may be making investments in companies that could be problematic down the line. It's significantly easier to keep things out of a portfolio, to screen beforehand, than it is once they're in the portfolio. It's very difficult to get them out. Even if the asset owner would like to exit, it's a very challenging process for them internally. So I would say sort of start the education process with UTIMCO and with others. Build the relationships with the technical experts, and try and be an asset to those institutions.
I have a question for Lillian. Lillian, I thought it was remarkable to see the counter petition by mostly engineering students that came out to your divestment proposal resolution. And I found it remarkable because I thought it sort of, quote unquote, spoke the quiet part out loud about how, about how much of the conversation about the defense industry is indeed one about employment. And I'm just wondering how people on campus reacted to that. Did it get much attention? Did it prompt conversations?
Yeah, so this entire process was virtual, of course. And so the only conversations that I am currently aware of about this counter petition were the ones in the student governance meetings, when we were, first of all, pitching and explaining and answering questions on our resolution, and then when it was time for the vote. So it was heard in student government twice, and in the graduate student assembly a few times, and then also in the Synod of College Councils a few times as well. So that did spark a lot of concern with students. We were put into breakout rooms, so we were able to kind of assure people that these companies are not creating their relationship on the basis of UTIMCO's investment in them. They're very much interested in UT producing world-class engineers because of their education system, and that and any time if they were to pull their recruitment from UT or just to deny jobs to UT students because their investment management company that they had nothing to do with was not investing in these companies, that they would be at a great loss for talent, and that would be kind of depriving themselves of a talent pool. So that was kind of our rebuttal, just making sure people knew that UTIMCO was not the one creating these relationships. It was the University of Texas system administration, the engineering school deans, for example, people who are organizing career fairs. And so just kind of reminding them that the fiscal asset management of the University of Texas systems and the actual educational career development parts are kind of working separately in that regard. And that was kind of the conversations that were had around that. But ultimately, our joint resolution ended up passing. It failed student government because of this big concern that kind of seemed to sway a lot of the representatives. But it only needed to pass through 2 out of 3 student governance bodies, which it did. And so now we're just we're working toward the implementation side now. So.
I'm going to jump back in here and point attention to the Q&A question from Andrew Feinstein. Andrew, thanks for jumping with that. I'm smiling to myself because Heidi Peltier is also one of the attendees here who might be able to directly answer some of the more recent research. And secretly, unknowns to anybody who wasn't part of the planning, we have Bill Hartung on call to tap in for certain questions as well, which I might call on. But Taylor, the new reporting you have out today actually does a lot of comparison about public investment and the number of jobs, which I thought was really interesting. And I didn't realize until I saw your article that was a part of what you were looking at. Do you want to maybe talk for a second about what you've found around this question, and then maybe we'll invite Bill. And before any of that, just want to let all the attendees know that they are certainly welcome to raise their hand, and I could potentially call on you all to ask a question or speak as well. We're trying to make this as interactive, but please do keep putting in questions. But over to you first, Taylor, and then maybe Bill, you'll want to come on screen as well.
No, thank you for the question, and I'm really excited to get to talk about my new story that's out. First of all, on Dr. Peltier's research that I've cited in more than one article of mine, she shows that weapons spending is really not a good way to create jobs, in part because it's capital intensive, meaning that less money goes straight to salaries, and that spending on green energy, education, healthcare are all ways that create more jobs than weapons spending. And even as a matter of fact, before I mention that, before I get into my Asheville reporting, back in Huntsville in that talk radio appearance that I mentioned with the 2 union leaders, they loved finding out about that piece of research. They thought it was great. They went back and took it to their union members to discuss it. So I'm just really appreciate that great work from Dr. Peltier, and I'm glad I'm able to cite it and share it. With regards to Asheville, I really didn't get to get into a lot of the meat of my reporting. What's happening there is a very large local subsidies package for the Raytheon division, which is Pratt & Whitney. In our piece, we did an original calculation of the local subsidies and handouts going to Pratt & Whitney, which are, among things like grants from the county government, grants from the state government, related infrastructure projects, donated land from a landowner, and it's coming to nearly $100 million. And just to put that in comparison, Asheville's been in the national spotlight over this past year for having passed a reparations proposal. And the proponents of the reparations proposal have a very modest one in comparison. It's $4 million spent on a variety of things, including affordable housing. What I liked reporting about in Asheville is that there is a pretty clear alternative to the military economy, and that is North Carolina's already burgeoning and robust solar sector, and that has plenty of room to grow, and ranks second nationwide in installed solar capacity. However, I believe it's something like 6% of the state's generation comes from solar sources, and the state still consumes more energy than it actually produces. And so in my piece, I highlight a similar economic development deal that went through right around the time the Raytheon deal went through. That was for a very innovative solar equipment manufacturer in the county next door that, among other things, involved a much, much lower amount of quote unquote incentive payments, involves jobs with similar wages, similar profile, and has room to grow. It's a company that makes solar distillation modules that use solar power to clean contaminated water like agricultural runoff and mining tailings. And they have other applications for their technology. For example, they said they think it can be used to reinvigorate stagnated ponds and reoxygenate them. So anyhow, I think it's very important. Like I said, what I try to practice is solutions journalism, which points out not just what the issue is, what the problem is, but where the potential solutions are.
Taylor, are these all privately held companies, or are there any of them publicly traded yet?
Are you referring to the defense contractors I reported on, or any of these solutions?
No, some of the companies that are transitioning.
I don't believe many of them are publicly traded. The small ones that I've mentioned now, the solar distillation firm and indeed American Wind in Huntsville, I believe are too small.
So as per Jeff's instructions, I'll weigh in. I'm the mystery panelist, Bill Hartung. I run the Arms and Security Program at the Center for National Policy. I think one thing about the alternative issue is it's a political problem. And there's no question that economically, these alternative investments would be better for workers, for communities, and for the planet. So the kind of work that's being done locally in Asheville, the kind of work we need at the national level, is going to get us over the top in terms of, make these changes. The military-industrial complex is kind of the path of least resistance for public investment because they have a big lobby. There's a history of doing this. Nobody's going to accuse you of being socialist for subsidizing cluster bombs, despite their obvious humanitarian, risks and dangers. So that's my first point. The second is with respect to arms sales, I would say there's other factors that further diminish the jobs involved. For example, countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, even European allies do some of the production on the weapons they buy from the United States in their own countries. So every dollar that's spent on arms sales does not go into jobs in the United States. Also, there's government subsidies for a lot of these sales to places like Israel, Egypt, and elsewhere. So those are tax dollars that could be better used elsewhere. And the exaggeration involved can be dramatic. Donald Trump claimed there were 500,000 jobs connected to arms sales to Saudi Arabia. We looked at kind of the stats and did some standard, estimates. It was about 20,000, sort of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the national workforce. So between the exaggeration, the overseas production, and then, of course, the most important fact of how these weapons are used, the jobs argument only holds up because of the political power of the military-industrial complex and the workers they bring along with them, who often feel they don't have an alternative.
Bill, along those lines, I have another question for you. So in your book, Prophets of War, which I have used for my thesis, by the way, so thank you for that resource. You mentioned the kind of the advertising strategies, particularly of Lockheed Martin, in really highlighting that jobs argument. I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about kind of how the defense industry itself has marketed job creation as one of its big lobbying tools, and then also as a tool to get public support.
Sure. Well, now I know at least one person read my book, so that's great. One of the things Lockheed Martin does, for example, on the F-35 program, is they have an interactive map of the United States, and you can press on the state and it'll tell you what they claim are the number of jobs involved. And at the time that I was doing my analysis, they said it was 125,000 jobs in 45, 46 states. But if you look more closely, first of all, more than 3/4 of the jobs, even by their estimate, were in just 3 states, California, Texas, and Georgia. So most states were not getting much out of it. If you pressed on Nebraska, for example, there was 1 job involved. And what that one person was doing, I have no idea, answering the phone maybe. So there's that element, but they put it up front in advertising, but they also use it in Congress. So they'll bring that data around with them and say, Representative X, if you vote against the F-35, you're going to lose X jobs in your district. You don't want to be that person who voted against jobs in your state or district. So that's the other element. And then, sometimes they also claim, which is not the case, that they have a diverse workforce, that they're kind of imparting skills. They do, Lockheed Martin sponsors science fairs for kids. So there's a whole kind of attempt to kind of make an antiseptic core around the fact that they make weapons that kill people. In fact, in their press releases, they call themselves something like a technology integration company or something, not a weapons company. So between the jobs element and how they portray themselves, I think that's a big part of how they they get what they want.
Thanks, Bill, and everyone for jumping in, and Taylor for jumping in on this. There's a couple of questions now in the chat, which I think are really interesting. I think maybe the first one from Walker Adams is, I don't know if anybody knows any more about this question of whether there are support networks emerging for community organizations or labor unions where workers can seek out support. And then Roy's question here to Rich, if it's not clear, let me know, Rich, and we can maybe put Roy on to ask it more clearly. But I think some questions for to Rich around sort of the different ways that this approach can be used would be great. We had a question ahead of time about whether there's sort of different approaches in different contexts. But let's take Walker Adams' questions first and then look at Roy's. So I don't know if any of the panelists know anything more. That's a really interesting example from Amarillo.
I'm happy to answer the support network question. Yeah, definitely when I do my reporting on the ground in communities, I am often very surprised, not very surprised, but I find it remarkable how persistent some of these peace groups have been on the ground. For example, I profiled a peace group in Huntsville that's been at it for 20 years doing a weekly protest. And very much taking on this jobs question and very much, having conversations with their neighbors about this, in empathetic ways. In Asheville, the crowd that's formed that calls themselves Reject Raytheon AVL, it's pretty extraordinary because they're not just saying don't create these jobs here. They're saying if you've got that amount for subsidies, we have plenty of other plans of how you could be using that. And among them are some indeed pretty hardcore labor advocates. And they've told me that, of course, the public learned too late of this project about this project in order to stop it. And now that it's coming to down, they want to help the workers unionize. Because that's actually a big part of the Asheville story is it appears to be what may be Pratt & Whitney moving jobs from a unionized workshop shop in Connecticut to quote unquote right to work North Carolina. And indeed, the salaries that have been in the press for workers don't look very good. And I've spoken with unionized workers before who have certainly earned more than that. I quote one local community college official saying that shop workers may make between $40,000 to $50,000 at this new Pratt plant. So yeah, I guess I would just say on the support networks, I think a lot of these defense communities actually do have, though small, some pretty persistent peace groups that also are very engaged in labor issues.
Thanks, Taylor. Anybody else have any other examples? I think we'll have to examine what's happening in the dice. So go ahead, Bill.
Well, historically, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there were national networks of localities working in economic conversion in the Silicon Valley, in St. Louis, in Connecticut, and elsewhere, and also a national center on economic conversion and disarmament, which was spurred in part by the work of Seymour Melman, who wrote a lot about economic conversion from the military. So it's happened before, and there's been leadership from unions. Walter Reuther of United Auto Workers, William Wimpensinger at the Machinists Union, wanted their workers to have an alternative when military spending went down, sort of ride that wave and build more stable employment opportunities. So I think there's certainly opportunity to knit some of these local efforts together into more of a national network, as has happened in the past.
Thanks, Bill. Rich, do you want to take on Roy's question?
Can we give Roy some airtime and have him explain his question a little bit more? There he is.
Yeah, g'day. So the question is basically about the idea of those who are investing, if there's possibly more a case of those who are already invested. So when they're kind of wrestling with the idea of divestment, etc., another potential strategy is to use your status as an investor to engage with the decision makers in companies and say, you should be changing your approach. You should be looking at conversion into other areas, etc. So using your investment status and maintaining your investment status and trying to influence from the inside rather than walking away. Of any kind of conversations that you're aware or examples of that going on? Is that, hopefully that's a little bit clearer. Over.
Yes, it's clear. So a few things. One, as I noted, we work primarily with faith-based investors and socially responsible investors. And so the reality is that they don't own much stock in the companies that we're talking about. In fact, most of them screened that out, as I said, back in the 1960s. And so the engagement model on the defense side is fairly limited. And the other thing is that these companies, they don't see much reason to have conversations with investors that don't own massive, amounts of shares. So that's something that limits that. It's a strategy we use regularly with other types of companies who are dealing with human rights issues in conflict affected areas. We much prefer to use the leverage of ownership to change policies. It just so happens that in this area with the large military contractors, it's quite difficult. Now I will say that's where we, sort of we have a new world upon us, right? So we have companies that our clients would like to own who are starting to make components or who are making products that surveil others, or that it's sort of the new weapons that we were talking about. That's where there's going to be a very interesting conversation over the coming years. Do you want the investors to divest, or do you want them to stay invested and to continue the dialogue and actually ask for changes in policies? And I think that's what makes. I think this is sort of that 1960s moment all over. We're going to have to make some strategic decisions here about what the approach will be. And I suspect that most of the investors that we work with and that we see will use their existing ownership to their advantage. Now, I will say, I think when you look at something like the NSO Group, when you look at these offensive cyber hacking tools, I suspect there will be lines drawn in the sand. I suspect those will not be purchased there. And you're going to see a global moratorium call. You're going to see nation states, I suspect, are sort of going to get back in the game now that they know they're being other states are spying on them using private technology. But I do think, generally speaking, you should use your leverage as a shareholder to your advantage, and we should be exploring more of those. And I think it's an area that activists can actually bring a lot more to the table in that setting, I think, than they can in simple divestment calls. Just one quick point. There is an increasing understanding among institutional investors about conflict. It is a major issue that is rising, as when we see polling of investors, and so that's another reason to engage with investors, because I think they're already they're being forced to focus the mind a bit. Again, that's just another reason, I think, to work with them in encouraging engagement, making sure, honestly, a lot of the investors don't know how deep these supply chains go and the connections that they have. So you'll find a lot of really quality, socially responsible investors who think they have clean portfolios. And for all intents and purposes, it's an honest reflection of how they view the portfolio, until they end up talking to the types of people who we have here today, who have taken a really hard look at the supply chains and have taken a really hard look at the industry and said, wait a second, there's components all throughout this. throughout your portfolio, and you do have exposure in different conflict affected areas. So I think the engagement process is something we should all be using to our advantage. Thanks.
I'm cognizant of time, and we do try to keep our meetings to the hour that we promised. So we're in the last 5 minutes. I want to just say a little bit on this point that Rich is starting to get into. It's related, but maybe slightly tangent. A number of people I know are now doing research around the arms trade treaty and whether that is becoming a factor in how investments. My dog has been bothering me the whole meeting, so hopefully you don't mind her appearance here in my screen. Factoring in the arms trade treaty and whether the arms trade treaty's calls about where what's responsible in the trade of weaponry, finding if there are examples where that's not happening to be a factor in investments, there are more examples of this now. So it's interesting to see how this international agreement might impact on the institutional investment side. It's another piece of work that I think a number of people are working at, and something that I'm hoping will be part of the series of conversations that the forum is trying to host. We only have a few more minutes, so I want to give I think I want to ask Taylor a question I didn't tell her I was going to ask, but I'm wondering if she's got a next community or two on her list for looking at. Before we got started today, she was telling me that what she has just found in Asheville, she really feels like you can find in many different places. And then I'll give everyone a chance if they have a last comment. I know there's a couple of unanswered questions, but I hope the attendees today enjoyed getting some really, I think, specific examples of work that's going on. But let me sort of ask you, Taylor, if there's a couple next you're looking at, and then just give everyone a chance for a closing thought.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So this story, even though I cover the defense industry, this led me kind of for the first time into the world of economic development, which is a whole other beast. And I think there is so much room for investigative journalism on this intersection of economic development agreements and the defense industry and these local subsidies and kickback packages that they're getting. There's an advocacy group called Good Jobs First, where you can search through their database to sort of come up with a tally of how much in local tax cuts, grants, et cetera, major companies have gotten. So yeah, there's definitely other places I want to take this lens. As I was wrapping up the story, a colleague who's a State House reporter here in Georgia said, "Taylor, do you know about this hullabaloo amongst state lawmakers over tax cuts for Lockheed Martin?" And sent me another article about this. And of course, Lockheed has deep roots here in Georgia. So I would happily investigate that and look into that. There's several places that I really enjoy working here in the South and reporting here in the South. The defense industry is very robust here. I'm thinking about something that Bill said a little bit earlier on the call about how, in communities where the defense industry is very prominent, and many of these corporations will do things like sponsor STEM scholarships, or in Huntsville, Alabama, Raytheon and Northrop Grumman have sponsored an entire new public school. I've thought about doing some work to, compare those local philanthropic donations with how much they're getting often in these local tax cuts and grants. So that's one area I may explore.
Thanks. Richard, Lillian, any quick comments on what's next, or just closing thoughts?
Oh, see. No, I just wanted, I find this to be an absolutely fascinating conversation. As for the arms treaty, I think that is something I've been speaking with Susie Snyder quite a bit about, and how we can, at the moment, we're spending a lot of time with investors reworking their policies, reworking their human rights policies, reworking their screens, and trying to update them for for the modern world. And I suspect that you will see that language built into more of them as one of the critical pieces that you hold up as a part of your best practices. And so I'm hoping that integration, you'll start seeing that integration over the next 1, 2, 3 years.
Thanks. Lillian?
Yeah, just wanted to address Mahboub's question about would it not be more effective if all anti-war organizations raise their voices against the weapons trade together instead of separately? And I want to say that that's a fantastic point, and I definitely believe in the power of coalition advocacy. And at the same time, I think we also can kind of make ourselves look a bit bigger than we actually are when we have a lot of different names signing on to different things, representing a lot of different organizations. I know it's kind of a niche field, and so in that way we can kind of, at the same time join forces, but also kind of represent a range of different ideas and interests that everyone has. And so it's also crucial whenever we have students from different universities doing their own campaigns specific to their own university and this divestment work. And so just want to maybe end on a note of thank you for that point about the importance of coalition advocacy and really making sure we're kind of all tuned into each other's work and kind of keeping that networking going. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Lillian. I'm laughing to myself, Taylor. I don't know if you saw the question from Daniel Mack about Brazil, but Daniel raises the point that this is an issue that is relevant in many places, not just in the United States. Obviously, this is a discussion about the United States. I want to take this quick moment to thank Lillian, Rich, and Taylor for agreeing to be panelists, to bring their expertise, for really exposing, I think, us to sort of your findings that I don't think are getting as much attention as they deserve. So it's really great, and I hope that we can continue to do this. For the people who are attendees, when you exit, you'll be taken to a poll. If you could just quickly fill out how this went, what you liked, what you thought we could do better, that would be fantastic. And with that, on behalf of the Forum on the Arms Trade, I want to thank you all for joining in today.